We are going to now speak with or listen to and then speak with Mark Chambers about design and creative thinking for climate solutions. Mark Chambers is the former director of the New York City Mayor's Office of Sustainability. He led policy and programs to confront climate change and inequality, two inextricable threads to America's largest city and our shared planet. An architect and urbanist, Mark leveraged the power of public policy and design to enable a resilient built environment where all New York City's 8.6 million residents can thrive and quickly transition to a zero carbon society. Previously, Mark served as the Director of Sustainability and Energy for Washington, D.C. He holds a graduate degree in public policy and management and an undergraduate degree in architecture, both from Carnegie Mellon University. Mark, thank you very much for joining us. You should be able to share your screen.
Yes, I just wanted to make sure you saw me to say thank you for having me. I'll share my screen now. We can kind of get started here. Just bear with me 1 second, everybody. So as Claudia mentioned, I've worn a lot of different hats and I continue to do so. But despite many of the different environmental roles that I've had, I started my career out as an architect, and I still am an architect, and I'm always driven by the design of three-dimensional things and how I can, pack and unpack those to be able to impact the physical world around us, and be able to truly understand that intersection of design and policy and climate. So the built environment is always extremely important to me. And when I think about these roles, I often think about, like, how can we maximize our climate impact in the next 10 years? And the reason I always say that is because, and why that's so important, is that we are at a very critical time in the story arc of our species. And I'll speak a little bit more clearly about that right now, because I want to make sure all of you understand what's at stake and why I think there's a pivotal role for designers, creatives, and artists to play in this. Over the last couple of years, we've seen data on top of data that has shown the fact that we are moving very quickly towards points of no return. There have been significant reports released. There's something referred to as the IPCC Report, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that was released a few years back that gave a very dire warning. And what it said was that, we have about 12 years or so to really correct course on how much greenhouse gases we're putting into the atmosphere based on how we live our lives, or we're going to see warming of the planet over 1.5 degrees. Now, beyond that threshold, we really start to get into a zone where we can't back up enough, right? We can't really adapt as well to an environment that gets too warm. And actually right after that report came out, maybe it's like 2 or 3 months later, 13 US governmental agencies also released additional warnings and reports that said that the climate, if unmitigated, then we would start to see as much as a reduction as much as 10% of the US economy because of climate change by the end of the century. So, and that was all before everyone even heard or thought about, COVID-19. So, which has had a devastating impact on our economy as well. So these things climate change has been reshaping and redefining our environment, our world for quite some time, and at an unprecedented rate. And it affects everybody, affects all of you, right? And so it's important to kind of make sure that everyone keeps in mind that there's no room on the sidelines, because everyone is impacted by our changing climate. And particularly, it continues to impact and fall hardest on the people that can least respond to it. It's not distributed equally. So those that are most vulnerable and those whose voices are least heard are very often in the front lines. That's what we call them, frontline communities of a changing climate. And that's extreme heat, that is, coastal storms, that is significant impacts from our changing environment. So when you hear people talking about climate issues, the reason I'm kind of starting out by giving you guys these facts and kind of details is that I want in your mind for you to be thinking climate issues. I hear you talking about that. I'm now waiting for you to hear people talk about social issues as well, because those things are tied together. You know, climate justice and social justice go hand in hand, and it's very important for everyone to constantly be asking that question as to if you're not hearing those things talked about together. And so I believe there is a lot of room for creatives and particularly New Yorkers from diverse backgrounds to and expertise to really impact all the policies and things that happen and shape the world around us. It's not for someone else. It's for all of you. It's for everyone to take a role, to be a part of this this transformation that's needed to be able to make sure we can hang out as a species a little bit longer. I mean, that's really what we're trying to get to. And so that's why I want to kind of talk to you guys today about and like hear from you today and kind of like talk about some of these like structures and things and programs that are in existence. And that we put in place because they have really lasting change that shape the environment that all of you are responding to. And so I wanted to show you guys something and kind of start off with what you're seeing on the screen. And I know you might be like, what is this thing and why is Mark showing this to me? This is actually an image taken by a photographer, Suzette Bazima. And so what you're looking at, and I probably should have done like a chat question to see if anyone had any ideas, but it's like what you're looking at on the screen is an ice core, which is like when you take a sample of ice from Antarctica, and it's approximately about 20,000 years old. And if you just look at it, you can see that kind of frozen motion. It's like this, you know, complex. As architects, we would call it like a figure ground drawing, where you can see the dark background, and it has like this, you know, frenetic vibe to it, where there's like these like almost like boulevards of like excitement and activity within these bubbles, you know, kind of crossing over this abyss. And you know, when you look at it, what I want you to do is to think about it and think about the idea that there's just layer, you know, upon layer of like pressurized layers of like these ice cores and they're really little bubbles that are kind of trapped and holding within those bubbles are holding the same composition of air at the moment in time in which they were frozen, right? So and who knows what's inside those little bubbles, you know, whether it's like dust particles or like pollen spores or some, you know, some random like you know, parts per million of carbon, as we would also talk about. But like think of them and look at them as little air fossils. And scientists, when they look at this, they can observe over 800,000 years of our climate history. And they can contemplate like not only what was in our climate's past, but it helps them to kind of really predict and think about what's in our future. And the reason I wanted to share this with you is because when I see cores visualized this way, I don't just see data, you know, about like these millions of different kind of things. What I see instead is like each microscopic like sphere, they're all like individual stories, they're experiences, they are layers of like hope for the future of like a living, breathing planet. And so, and I always think like, I contemplate like, what does this, what you know, like, it's almost like, what does the ice say about all of us, you know? And like, and if we were to, you know, capture ice today, like what would it say to future generations about us at this point in time? You know, would it capture, you know, incredible things happening in our atmosphere right now? Would it capture smoke from fires burning, you know, for millions of acres of lands all across, you know, the country? We just had the hottest summer on record. The year before that was also the hottest summer on record. You know, would it capture, you know, some memory of this global pandemic that we're all experiencing right now, which has just left, you know, over 1 million dead, or millions dead, really, and 450,000 Americans. So it's, you know, what does it say about all what's happening right now? What would it say about us, right? And so when people ask me what sustainability means to me, I say that it means changes over time. And I think that it also, the meaning of it changes over time. You know, it used to be all about like balance, right? It used to be about like everyone living in balance with the planet. And then I think it's changed to be more about like limits, like we can't do this because we need a limit on the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. We need a limit on the different things that how we're changing the world around us. But it's still changing. And I think what we're seeing right now is like another evolution of the word sustainability. And I think that it's sustainability is finally coming face to face with the realization that it's impossible to really get everyone to move towards fighting climate change in the same way unless we really address some of those really core societal ills and obstacles to everyone being able to contribute. So I think right now that sustainability is forcing us to recognize that if people are going to want to contribute towards this effort, you have to combat structural inequality, you have to combat racism, you have to combat xenophobia. Like what we're experiencing now is that sustainability is now more about justice. And so I think as technologists and designers and artists, creatives, I think that it's important for all of you, in order to be a part of this work against climate change, which is why I'm here and why I want to talk to you, I think it's important for you to also be thinking about justice. And that is something that I think is a very strong driver and a catalyst for some of the most creative works that I've seen. And so what I thought today is that in addition to kind of telling some of these background stories, which may or may not be interesting to all of you, I wanted to just talk a little bit about some of the principles of design justice. And hopefully that can kind of spur a lot more conversation. And also, I'm really anxious to get to the back end of this where we start talking a little bit more about in the Q&A section. So maybe I'll go through this quickly so we can actually just get talking, and I can tell you a little bit more about some of the projects I've been working on. But I wanted to kind of dive just directly into the main principles of design justice. Now, here's the deal. There is an organization, Design Justice Network, that over a multi-year process, they basically came up and ultimately gifted the world with 10 principles of design justice. And I found them to be really informative in how you evaluate the ability for policies to actually take root and make sure that they're not just things that you are thrusting upon different environments, but they're actually things that can truly inspire more people to be involved and can grow the tent of the work that you're doing. And so I'm going to kind of go through these and talk a little bit about them, because ultimately, again, for what I do in the world of kind of policy and governance and a lot of other things, it ends up being something where the work that I do is only as good as the amount of coalition building I can do to bring to that point in time, and then the amount of trust that I can build to be able to take this work forward afterwards. So this is actually when we released what we call the Green New Deal for New York City. There's me beside the mayor when people can go outside and hang out together. And this is, again, the culmination of a lot of work to really define much more about what's possible for the future of the city. And what this was us releasing a plan that at its core was going to dramatically reduce New York City's contribution to climate change. And one of the most important parts of that is in the buildings that make up our city. New York City, again, largest city in the country, there's over 1 million buildings in the city. Literally over 1 million, and buildings represent the core of our contribution to climate change. So it's the energy that it takes to heat and cool those buildings to keep them operating, all electricity in those buildings. That's all of the energy that's used to create that. That's where the most of our greenhouse gases come from. So it's important for us to attack those head on. And at this point, what we were doing is releasing a plan in which we set a line in the sand and said that a few years from now, there's going to be a cap that goes into place on the amount of greenhouse gases that these buildings behind me in this picture can be responsible for. So big buildings all throughout the city, starting in 2024, they can only be responsible for a certain amount of greenhouse gases. Over that, the building owners have to pay a huge fine. And that fine is the same amount of money that it would cost them to actually improve the building, make the building use less energy, make the building better for the tenants that are in those buildings, make the buildings operate better, use less energy. And that way, we're really kind of pushing things forward to get better spaces for New Yorkers, but also to make it a place where those things are contributing less to climate change. But it doesn't come, without like a lot of real engagement, and that's where I think it's important to really engage creatives, because in government work, we're not great at communicating with people. It's not our strong suit. We try, but ultimately, I think people are more driven when you are able to better and more directly connect the work that we're trying to make happen with the representation that it has of the people that are most impacted by it. And I think that's where designers and creatives have a role to play that is not often offered to them. I think we often look at designers and creatives to give commentary on the world around us, but not necessarily to be an active part and to be able to truly help us communicate better in this world. So going to design principles. So the way in which I think it's helpful for us to think about this is using the principles from the Design Justice Network. And what they did is that they set out and said, the first principle is that we use design to sustain, heal, and empower our communities, as well as to seek liberation from exploitive and oppressive systems. This is a lot packed in there, but it's really critical for us to start to think about how the work we're doing is actually impacting people, and is it healing them, is it empowering them, and is it giving everyone an opportunity to no longer have these obstacles placed in front of them. And this is a great example, I think, in a lot of ways of what we say when there are things that are oppressive and present when we think about the built environment. In New York, this is something this is Ravenswood, and people may or may not be familiar with this, but it's a large fossil fuel kind of energy producing facility. It is responsible and kind of like very important to providing electricity and power to New York City, but it's also like right in the middle of the city, and it's something that because of a lot of legacies of policy, we have to confront the fact that there are people that are growing up right in the background, in the backyard of large facilities like this that are burning fossil fuels, contributing to climate change, contributing to air pollution, and simultaneously limiting the ability for everyone right around it to contribute to the work that's necessary. So this is what we talk about when we need to confront some of those pieces that are not just caustic, but they're also really impacting the lives of people, and that we have to healing if we're actually going to get people to be able to participate. The next principle, I think it's also incredibly important, and there are 10 of them, mind you, is we center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. So again, I think you guys will start to think about the thematically how this impacts the kind of things that you can do. It's important to not co-opt the kind of work that's driving the interventions that you're using to try to fix the world around us, right? So part of that means bringing more people to the table and letting them speak for themselves, right? So it's not about me just doing surveys for different communities and then summarizing those based on what I think. Let people speak for themselves, bring them into the conversation, have them have a seat at the table, and then allow for them to fully participate in the process that determines the outcomes that will impact them. That's how you actually get buy-in, and it's also how you actually get solutions that truly address people's problems and not just your interpretation of their problems. And here's an image kind of showing one of the kind of engagement activities, having these roundtables, having like really clear ways in which we are talking with community members, getting immediate feedback and being accountable and responsive to them is also part of how we do that. And as designers, I think it's important, whether to consistently think about how do you assemble groups that will help drive you to kind of better solutions and better kind of design outcomes. And that has a lot to do with making sure that your stakeholder engagement is something that is organized and is something that brings various different groups together so that you're not always looking at one side of a problem. Principle 3, we prioritize design's impact on the community over the intentions of the designer. Now, this is something that, as an architect, has always been a challenge, because in your mind you always have a notion of like what you think would be like a really dope way to solve a problem in the physical world. What kind of material, what kind of structure, what kind of articulation of that material, and that is about me, right? As opposed to it being more about what is actually going to be in service of those that the art, the work, the design is in support of. And so it's a tough one, but it's also something that I think is important to constantly keep in mind, because if you put the work in to be able to make sure that you are allowing that participation, allowing those charrettes to really kind of embody the true kind of needs, like preferences of the communities that you're serving, it will actually make you better designers, right? And it will actually make you better able to cross the different spectrums of where your design can play a role. And I want to kind of step back for a second. One of the reasons why I'm kind of going through this process and talking to you from perspective of someone who works in government and does policy work is that I think that there's a misconception about the role that artists can play in actually developing policies around their communities and being an active voice in that. I think that it's important to know how we function so that you can fully participate in that and show up when you have opportunities, because we need you much more than I think you realize to actively help us articulate and understand and unpack what the experiences are of the communities that we're serving. And so being organized around how we do that, and you being organized around how you do that for your clients and your communities, I think is important. Principle 4, we view change as emergent from an accountable, accessible, and collaborative process, rather than as a point at the end of a process. So it's not just about, hey, we need to get to this end game because we said we're going to do it, and whatever it takes, let's make that happen. That is one way to do things. It is not a successful way to do things. And one thing that I've learned in working in various different government settings is that you do need to be clear about what your intent is, but you have to make sure that you recognize that the policy has to shape based on the impact and the influence of those that are represented there. So it's important to make sure that everyone is at the table, but then it's also important to recognize that you might shift off of what you thought you were the end result was going to be. And that's okay. That is part of like being, again, whether you're designing policy or designing like art, it's important to make sure that you recognize that change is a good thing, and it kind of drives us to be better and get solutions that are actually more impactful and more honest. And again, like one of the ways in which people voice their feelings and their kind of opinion about the policies that I develop or people develop is by showing up. And so it's important to make sure that we create the apparatus to listen to the voices of people, even if they think we can't hear them. And so I have to make sure that I'm constantly opening different channels to make sure that it's not just what comes in my email is what matters. So another kind of key and thing for you to think about is, how are you setting yourself up to truly get feedback and truly get information that makes you better designers, but also makes you more responsive to the true needs of those that you're serving. Principle 5, we see the role of the designer as a facilitator rather than an expert. Again, I think that this speaks to the notion of being more collaborative as opposed to being a professor. A lot of us have disciplines that are incredibly well-earned and well-honed over time. However, a true designer, I think, has the ability to also sharpen the saw of that design work by truly bringing more people into effectively into the conversation that determines the outcome. And that may also have a lot to do with creating environments, situations where people feel comfortable sharing and doing that in a way where we can actually be, you can have outcomes that look, might be slightly different than what you originally intended, but do give a little bit more clarity around what is possible. And again, one of the ways we love to do that in this kind of environment now is to look at and if you guys have ever used Mural, but it's one of the ways to do like really creative kind of post-it board sessions that are thoughtful and engaged, but also digital, so that you're not solely having to deal with everyone being in the same room at the same time. Principle 6, and I'll try to go through this quickly because I actually kind of want to get to talking with you guys. We believe that everyone is an expert based on their own lived experience, and that we all have unique and brilliant contributions to bring to a design process. This has a lot more to do with kind of recognizing that every voice matters, and every voice that leads to more clarity around the problem that you're trying to solve for really does make you a better designer. But it doesn't happen by accident. It requires you to create an environment where that voice can show up. One of the problems we always had, when I was working at City Hall, is that in City Hall you have a situation where you need to have a stakeholder meeting. I want everyone involved to come and talk, and that may be at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and that's not when everyone's available, right? And it took a long time, and to be honest, a lot more has happened during the pandemic to make it really clear that if you make it more accessible, more people will come. If we see a larger voting turnout, it's not just because more people want to vote, it's because voting has become more accessible. You can vote earlier, you can vote longer during the day, and voting in different ways. That's the kind of thing that starts to change outcomes, not because people are more or less interested, but because you found ways to include them. And that is also an important lesson for anything that is that requires a design mind to be able to articulate. Principle 7, we share design knowledge and tools with our communities. Of course, incredibly important to make sure that we're creating an environment. This is from our small business organization that from New York City government, that kind of speaks a little bit to how you don't just take from a community about like their needs, wants, and so forth, but you actually can use that connection as an opportunity to increase the awareness of people to do skills training. So right now you can go to, whether it's the New York City Small Business Services website, or you can go to the New York City Economic Development Corporation, both of which have incubators and ways in which people can have skills training that allows for them to better participate in lots of different components of the work the city's doing. Principle 8, we work towards sustainable, community-led, and controlled outcomes, which I think is also something that is really critical. This is a picture from this place called Harlem Grown, which is a wonderful organization in New York City. But bottom line is that it allows for there to be much more community-driven outcomes. And this one is more of like an urban farm kind of setup. But what they are also very good at is that coalition building and skills training, as well as making sure that there's an opportunity for a lot more kind of corporate involvement and investment that allows the impact of this kind of community-run facility to grow far beyond the boundaries of this just this site. And it's something that not only connects people to the community and kind of to the earth, but it also allows for them to have lots of other opportunities based on the involvement that happens from all the people supporting this institution. Principle 9, we work towards non-exploitive solutions that reconnect us to the earth and each other. Again, and that same example from Harlem Grown is a perfect example. But again, looking at this, I think it's also important to remember that you have to put the fail-safes in place to make sure that you're not unintentionally exploiting the people that you're trying to serve, right? And so by the reason why these different principles actually ring true to me and to a lot of people doing this kind of work is because they give us a rubric to go back to. You can always go back and look at the decisions that you made and see whether or not they were actually problematic, and then where you can course correct them quickly. So it's a really good feedback loop to be able to make sure you're making good decisions and supporting the people that you're representing. And the last principle here that I want to kind of talk about is, before seeking new design solutions, we look for what is already working at the community level. We honor and uplift traditional, indigenous, and local practices. And I think that this is a wonderful place to kind of leave this on, because you know, there's often a desire or a situation in which people think that you have to recreate the wheel in order to be able to provide something new to an environment, provide something new to a community, and it's not true. Oftentimes, especially when it comes to sustainable design and communities responding to a changing climate, whether that's increased heat or flooding or increased storms, people are resilient, and they consistently show the ability for them to be resilient. And a lot of it has to do with us being able to pay attention, listen to those, empower and uplift those, and without just doing the kind of process of cultural erasure, where we just kind of go in and assume that everyone knows what's best for different areas. We don't. So it's important to create opportunities to listen, and then it's important to then use that as a way to really kind of dig deep into what solutions already exist and how can we make them better, and give the people that have been doing this hard work for such a long time the resources and support they need to keep going. So I hope that was interesting for you guys. I find it to be incredibly important. I know it's kind of like it feels like it might be like we're in class, but I think that being able to have something like that, which is really kind of useful and important to go back to, is something that you can take with you no matter where you're going, and be able to use that to impact the types of decisions that you make and how you make them in a way that is more responsible, more thoughtful, more sustainable, and I think more in line with a value-based process that gets us to a place that's more inclusive and more supportive of the type of environment that's going to be necessary for us to truly build the community necessary to combat some of these really these hard questions around climate. So I'm open to questions. Again, I've kind of worked in a lot of different environments. I continue to do that, but all of this does kind of speak to how do we create a better place for more people to be involved in fighting the kind of, you know, the great like generational crisis of our time, which is dealing with climate. So open to questions. Again, hope you thought that was helpful. But more importantly, we'd just love to kind of talk with everyone and see if there's anything that I can help answer.
Thanks, Mark. Very helpful. It's getting dark. I'll turn on the light in a minute, but it felt a little bit like being in a classroom, but you know what? It's really great to get a framework for something. There are a lot of frameworks in the art world, and to be able to see this cross-disciplinary through architecture and design as well. There are several questions for you in the Q&A box.
So it's the first thing is saying, this is interesting. These design justice values are precisely in alignment with the ideal ethics of socially engaged art. Couldn't agree more. And I think but I also feel like what we've learned for those of us that are not always in the art kind of world is that it's also not just aligned, but it's also incredibly necessary. It's what's been missing. And so I think it's very important to make sure that you have a rubric to go back to that helps some of those decision making. But socially engaged art is actually a really important interchangeable term. Next question is, as creative, I feel like I have the responsibility to work in this framework of design justice and to use design tools such as equality and human-centered design frameworks to really empower people in the environment. How do I get into the industry, such as government and policy work, as a designer, artist, creative, who wants to work in these spaces? And are there tips on how to do that? Absolutely. So part of one of the reasons why I think it's important to do events like this and then talk with people is that we're not good at talking. You don't know we exist because we're terrible at it. And so it's important to make sure that there are always communications, there are always kind of policy opportunities that require interdisciplinary voices and people to be responsive to them. And I think that what you'll find is that if you look for the opportunities around kind of content development, design, some of that is technical, but a lot of times it's not. It goes more into the communications world. But it actually, the skill sets often align. And so I would look towards those places, and not just in government, but in places like organizations, and even like commercial businesses and corporations have. There's a lot more folks work on corporate social responsibility and environmental and social goals that are socially conscious goals that allow for businesses to be expanding the roles within them that are speaking to how they are engaging their clients, or their the populations they're serving, or everyone. So I would say, as far as government's concerned in policy, look towards the kind of creative side of things, where like in City Hall, there's something we have called creative comms, which deals with all of the way in which we create visuals and work, and did create visuals and work for the mayor and for other places. That exists in organizations as well. And it's a great place to get a foothold in, and then to be able to start interpreting policy better for everyone. Another practical example, let's see. Can you walk us through a specific design project and how it considers some of these ideas? Yes. And then, okay. So one example of a design project I'll kind of walk you through is, I am sure that I'm looking around to see if I even have one here. So this is not one of the ones I'm going to talk about, but this is a Swell water bottle, right? And I'm not advertising for Swell, but just want to let you know, right? And so we were attracted to Swell because they design really nice bottles, and we have an active work that we need to be able to reduce the amount of plastic that people are using across the board. Single-use plastic is an incredibly pernicious problem. You guys know about it. You get something, you throw it away. There's too much plastic in the environment. It ends up in oceans, ends up in lots of places. Swell, as a reusable metal bottle manufacturing private business, wants to eliminate ocean plastic. And that's in line with the work that I was doing when I was part of the city. And so what we did is we got together and we said, hey, look, you're trying to do something positive. We're trying to convince a new generation of New Yorkers to not continually take a plastic bottle when they can reuse one, and kind of we can reuse a reusable bottle, a reusable water bottle. And we got Swell, the Swell organization, to donate 320,000 reusable water bottles to every single New York City public high school student. And so we organized around a way to be able to not just distribute those in a matter of like a day, but also to create a design competition for high school students, that we created stickers and all these different things where they could design an actual bottle that Swell then made into an authentic bottle that was limited edition, the winner in that contest. The point is, there's a part where everyone starts to be able to win as a result of this. We're getting more plastic bottles out of the system, out of the waste stream. People are getting into the habit of reusing water bottles. Water is better to be drinking from a health perspective, and it's something that is actually like a beautiful kind of bottle, which allows for, I think, a certain design aesthetic to better capture the kind of imagination of a population that is young enough to create habits that over the course of their lives, as they go into not from young adulthood into adults, they're going to have a habitual notion of how to constantly use reusable water bottles instead of plastic water bottles. And that gets to those outcomes that policy alone can't. I mean, I can ban reusable water bottles and try to make that happen in different cities, and have in certain places, but ultimately design trumps that in a lot of different ways. So getting people to actually be engaged and also inspired, I think, is something that this community is far better at doing, and we just need to create opportunities for our work to go together. Let's see. Okay, and that was the specific example. I'm looking to see if there's any more questions. All right, here's one that popped up. All right. These principles seem disingenuous in relation to the capitalistic interests of the urban reality precondition design initiatives. They're about designer and relationship to people, but need to also address resistance strategies. Sure, I mean, I think that not everything is a solution for everything, right? I would counter the notion that the principles are disingenuous. I think that they speak to how, and also I don't represent the network, so I'm not like trying to defend them, but from my own perspective, I think that they are actually quite useful in terms of how do you articulate the right types of questions to ask both yourself and those that you're working with in any condition. So I think that there's always going to be interests that are counter to that. But the question is, what are you going to do, right? And how are you going to like position yourself to be able to truly be a part of an environment that is actively looking towards better solutions that are more inclusive and less exclusive of voices that have been excluded for far too long. So I think that a part of it solves some part of that problem, not all of it, but I think that if more people are creating the framework to be able to ask the right questions and to push on those when they're not answered, I think that gets us into a better place and it gets us to a place more quickly. Trying to see, I think that's all the questions so far.
All right, and as you did say, especially the group of people that are tuning in today, these are the people who are very good at engaging the public. Most of the people here are artists who do socially engaged work, arts administrators. So now tell us how to do it. If we wanted to, if somebody has a project that relates to climate change or environmental protection, and they would like to like do something specific, like for example, get those bottles for the schools, you know, something that very specific, then how can we work with you, or who should we reach out to? Like, what's the process exactly? And there's one more
question. Absolutely. Yeah, I'll answer. I see that last question about airlines and sports events. I'll actually answer that one, and then I'll answer Claudia, your question. So honestly, there's a carrot and a stick approach. What we talked about, all this evening is a lot to do with carrots. How do you, create a better environment? How do you kind of use things that incentivize and make people want to do the right thing? Sticks are also important too. So when it comes to large entities like airlines and sports events and sporting like arenas and so forth, like I believe that those need regulation. So you need to make it impossible for them to do the wrong thing. And there are a lot of different ways in which both of those entities can actually use compostable utensils and items that are not contributing to the waste stream. And part of that just means putting policies in place that force them to do so. And here's the rub, and here's where it comes back to Claudia's question, is that I can create all the policies in the world that I think are most important, but what happens is that they have to be supported in order for them to actually become something that is useful. And the problem is that the people that are often most affected by it are not often the loudest voices in the room. So if you have entrenched interests, people that want to use single-use plastics that are predominantly sourced from virgin fossil fuels, then they will show up and make sure that their interests are being protected. Everyone else needs to show up too. How you do that, how you get involved, has a lot to do with using the same means of communication that you do with each other, with other places, to your advantage. Twitter, Instagram, like all the policy places that I've worked, and all the government places that I've worked, we all have conduits that come directly to us. So it's not just this monolithic thing where it's just the government of New York City or the government of Washington, D.C. or some other government. All within them, they have sustainability offices, they have chief sustainability officers, they have and they're always very easy to find. And we also have responsibilities to be responsive. So another thing that's good to know is that when you reach out to government officials, they have a responsibility to get back to you within 24 hours or like the next business day or something along those lines, depending on where you are. And so being able to like, it's not just a matter of like of not knowing where to look. Like, look for the sustainability offices in your kind of local area, but then also like reach out directly to those people. Use social media. It's incredibly useful and helpful, and we get it directly, so it's very easy to do that. Also, the last thing I'll say on this is the collective power of assembly and of people kind of coming together around some of these causes is also incredibly powerful right now. So it's not just about saying that we want to make sure that sports arenas no longer have single-use plastics. It's about kind of getting online and creating a kind of network of folks that are also have that same effort, and then putting pressure on all the different pieces of that puzzle. So like putting pressure on the arena, putting pressure on the local council member, putting pressure on the sustainability officers, putting pressure on the waste, the leaders of the sanitation departments. All those things are all available at your fingertips. Probably this is probably a better way to say it. And those things can actually truly be a really great way to get to the people that are actually making the decisions.
All right, thank you very much, Mark. Really appreciate your time.